In the heart of a brutal winter, a reclusive prince, mourning a tragic past, finds his solitude shattered by a mysterious woman at his door, half frozen and desperate for shelter. Her arrival unearths devastating secrets, long-buried betrayals, and the chilling suspicion that the past he thought was laid to rest might have been a lie. As truths unravel and danger closes in, the lonely prince must confront the darkness hidden in his own bloodline and risk everything to heal two wounded souls bound by heartbreak and betrayal. The wind howled across the slopes of the Sierra de Guadarrama like a beast caught between the peaks. Snow had been falling for hours, dense and blinding, covering every visible path, erasing even the smallest trace of human presence. The trees groaned beneath the weight of it, their limbs creaking, stripped of color and sound save for the violent hush of the blizzard. In the heart of the forest, where few dared wander in fair weather, let alone during a storm, stood a stone cabin, squat and narrow-shouldered against the white. Inside, Don Sebastián de Aragon sat alone before the fire. The flames sputtered in the grate, stoked but reluctant, casting orange light on the worn wooden floor and the uneven stones of the hearth. The cabin had been built by his grandfather generations ago, meant as a hunting retreat, though no gun or hound had entered in years. It was spare, a single chamber with a hearth, a cot, a pine-wood table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cabinet where the most essential provisions were stored. A heavy curtain hung along the rear wall, concealing a small alcove once used for storage. Now it remained untouched. Like most of the cabin, it carried the scent of dust and pine resin, soaked with years of silence. Sebastian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, letting the heat of the fire press against his face. His clothes bore the damp chill of the mountain, despite the fire and the thick wool cloak draped over his shoulders. He had not spoken aloud since before the storm began. There was no one to speak to. By his own command, the estate staff had remained in Segovia. His guards, his stewards, even his personal secretary, all dismissed with clear instructions that he was not to be disturbed. Out here, isolation was both punishment and reprieve. His dark hair had grown longer than custom allowed, curling against his collar. A week's growth of beard shadowed his jaw, and his gray eyes, once described as cold by enemies and unreadable by friends, had taken on a sunken, haunted look. The silence suited him. It dulled thought, memory, regret. He had lost the taste for conversation, for company. The world beyond the mountains had nothing left to offer him. Then came the sound. At first, he thought it part of the wind, a crack or shift in the trees, but it came again, sharper this time. A knock, so faint it might have been imagined. He froze, his hand still on the poker in the fire. The knock repeated, slow and uncertain, as if from a hand too weak to insist. He stood, slowly, his body alert, his instincts sharpened by solitude. No one should be here, not in this weather, not unless they had been led. He reached for the pistol resting on the mantel, checked the chamber, and moved toward the door. The knock came again. He paused just before the threshold, his breath shallow. Outside, the wind shrieked past the shutters, but within the narrow pause between gusts, he could hear a human breath, ragged, close. He unbolted the door and pulled it open. The wind rushed in first, biting and full of snow. For a moment he saw nothing but white, then she stood at the threshold, cloaked in frost, her face pale beneath a hood rimmed with snow. Her clothes were soaked, the thin wool gown clinging to her like a second skin, torn at the sleeves and hem. The snow had gathered along her shoulders, her lashes, her boots. Her eyes, dark and wide, locked onto his with a desperation that was eerily silent. She trembled, not with the fine shiver of cold, but with a full-bodied convulsion, as though her bones themselves resisted her will. Her lips parted, cracked and bluish. They barely shaped the words. Por favor. Abrigo. Sebastian did not move. He stared at her, half certain she was a trick of the storm. Her presence was too improbable, too surreal. How had she come here? There were no visible tracks behind her, no horse, no carriage, no signs of a path. And yet she stood there, barely upright, the cold stealing her strength with every breath. He stepped aside. She moved past him on unsteady legs, her boots leaving melted impressions on the floorboards. The heat of the fire met her halfway, but it was not enough. Her body sagged as she reached the hearth, her knees folding beneath her. She dropped to the floor in silence, one arm falling to her side, the other resting against the stone. Her breath came in harsh little gasps. He shut the door and bolted it. Only then did he approach her, cautiously, his pistol still resting loosely in his hand. He set it on the table within reach, then knelt beside her. He reached to pull away the heavy cloak she wore, soaked and stiff with ice. As he eased it from her shoulders, he saw the stain, dark and drying, just above her left side, seeping through the bodice of her gown. Blood. His hand hesitated, then moved to lift the edge of the fabric. The wound wasn't fresh. No longer bleeding, but still tender and raw, the skin around it purpling. It looked like an old laceration, long and jagged, the kind caused by something not sharpened, but torn, perhaps from a fall or a struggle. But what caught his attention most was the scar. High on her ribcage, barely visible in the firelight, was a thin crescent of raised flesh, an old mark, pale against her skin. Familiar, in a way he couldn't place. He was still staring when she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and then fixed on him with startling clarity. Her hand shot out, fast and unsteady, wrapping around his wrist. Her grip was stronger than it should have been. "Where is your wife?" she whispered. The room fell into silence so complete that even the fire seemed to dim. The sound of the question hung in the air longer than it should have, suspended like frost on a pane of glass. Sebastian did not answer. Could not. He looked down at the woman's hand around his wrist, small, trembling, but holding with a will that defied her condition. Her fingers, cold as river stones, dug into his skin with surprising strength. She repeated nothing. Her eyes, though ringed by exhaustion, stayed locked with his. The flames in the hearth shifted behind them, casting restless shadows across the stone floor, throwing light and dark over her features, as if the fire itself were undecided about revealing her. Her breath came shallowly now, the edge of it catching like thread through a needle. Whatever reserves had allowed her to cross the storm were nearly gone. At last, she released him. Her hand fell limply against her side, and her eyes fluttered closed again. But Sebastian remained frozen beside her, pulse thudding in his ears, her question echoing with a sharpness that cut past the years. "Where is your wife?" He hadn't heard that word spoken aloud in this room in nearly 3 years. Not by servants, not by the priest, not by himself. Not even in thought, if he could help it. The name was a wound too old to bleed, and yet too deep to ever truly close. He reached for a woolen blanket draped over the back of the nearby chair and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. Her clothes were sodden and frigid, clinging to her like second skin. He moved quickly, setting the pistol out of reach, but keeping it close enough that his instincts could rest. Then he poured broth from the pot above the fire into a pewter cup and brought it to her lips. "Drink," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. She didn't respond, her body limp with exhaustion. He touched the cup gently to her mouth, and some part of her responded. Her lips parted slightly, and he tipped the cup slowly. The liquid touched her tongue. She swallowed, barely. Then again. He crouched beside her and stayed that way, holding the cup, watching her draw each sip like it cost her. Her skin was chalky, the hollows of her cheeks shadowed by fatigue and cold. The bruise across her temple had begun to darken into deep plum, disappearing into the edge of her damp hairline. "You'll freeze if you sleep like this," he muttered. Still, she said nothing. Eventually, she blinked up at him. The intensity in her eyes had not faded. It had merely settled beneath the surface, watchful, unrelenting. "Your name?" he asked, quiet but firm. "What is it?" Her lips moved. "Catalina." She gave no surname. He stared at her for a moment longer. The name stirred nothing familiar in him. But the way she spoke it, flat and unsentimental, without pride or apology, felt like a warning. The storm outside screamed again, rattling the shutters. Sebastian stood, stepping away from her as if proximity had become dangerous. He dragged the extra cot from the wall, placing it near the fire, then returned to her. She swayed as he helped her to her feet, her body like a reed bent by water, too fragile to hold its shape without support. He guided her to the cot and eased her down onto it. She hissed softly through her teeth at the pain in her side. The blood-stained bodice was still damp. He reached for the blanket again and wrapped it around her carefully. She exhaled, a sound between a sigh and a moan, and leaned back. "You'll need to change into something dry," he said. "I'll find a shirt." "No," she murmured. "Just warmth, for now." He turned away from her, returning the cup to the table, trying to ignore the sharp weight of her question. She hadn't asked it idly, and she had spoken it with the precision of someone who knew it would strike deep. He hadn't answered. Not aloud. But she hadn't asked again either. She watched him from the cot. Even in pain, even half frozen, there was calculation in her gaze. Not cruel, but sharp, like someone who had learned not to waste movement. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the stillness of her posture. "I'll need to see the wound," he said. She nodded faintly. "Later, when I can breathe." He said nothing else. Silence returned like a tide. The fire spat and cracked. The walls creaked under the pressure of the wind. He moved to the chair opposite the cot and sat, resting his forearms on his thighs, watching her. The clock on the mantel ticked once, then again. She closed her eyes. For nearly an hour they remained like that, both still, both silent. The only sounds were from the storm and the slow thawing of her clothes dripping onto the floor. He should have questioned her further, demanded to know how she'd found this place, how she knew of his wife, had known her, he now realized. But something restrained him. A hesitation he didn't understand. Catalina did not sleep, though her breathing slowed. She did not speak. But when he stood to stir the fire, she turned her head slightly, following his movement. "You knew her," he said finally. Her gaze remained fixed on the fire. "She cried when she died," she said, as if speaking to the flames instead of him. "Not from pain, from betrayal." He froze. The poker slipped slightly in his grip. He turned toward her. "What did you say?" But she didn't answer. Her eyes were half-lidded, her voice faint. He took a step toward her. "What do you know about her?" Catalina turned her head slowly and looked at him. Her expression was composed now, steady, almost calm. "She cried," she repeated. "And before she died, she said something to you. Something no one else heard." He stared at her, breath caught in his chest. "She said," Catalina continued softly, "Don't let him find the letters. Burn them. Promise me, Sebastian. Promise me." The breath left his lungs as if he'd been struck. He had never repeated those words to anyone. Not to the priest who came to bless the body. Not to the doctor. Not even in confession. Isadora had spoken them in a whisper, her voice cracked with fever and fear, her hand gripping his shirt as blood stained the sheets. No one could have known them. No one had been there. He stared at Catalina, his heart thudding in his chest, cold now not from the storm, but from something much older and far more dangerous. She said nothing more. He stepped back from the cot, away from her, almost tripping over the chair behind him. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. His mouth was dry. He had buried her. He had buried the past. But the woman in his cabin, the half-frozen stranger who called herself Catalina, had just opened the door to it. He was about to speak, to demand an answer, when she turned her face toward him once more. And then her eyes drifted to the music box on the far shelf, half hidden beneath an old shawl. She looked at it too long. Far too long. The fire had burned down to red coals, casting a soft, steady glow that barely reached the corners of the cabin. Outside, the storm had begun to slow, but the wind still dragged across the shutters in long, hollow sighs. Inside, time had turned heavy and slow, as though the snow pressing against the roof had frozen the air itself. Sebastian hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes. He stood near the window, one hand braced against the wall, his back to Catalina. His eyes were fixed on the flicker of the candle, though he saw nothing. Her voice still echoed in his head, words only one person should have known. He had whispered them to Isadora in the final hour, his voice breaking, her fingers barely clinging to his. Her lips had been chapped from fever, her breath shallow, her gown soaked with sweat and blood. She had begged him not to let Luis find the letters. That part she'd said twice. Sebastian had nodded, numb with grief, and made the promise. Afterward, he'd found the letters hidden in her writing desk, tucked between pages of an old French novel. He hadn't burned them. He'd hidden them, locked them away in the only place no one else could reach. He didn't remember crossing the room, but now he stood at the cabinet against the wall. Its doors were plain, the wood darkened with age and oil. He crouched, moved aside a stack of folded linens, and reached beneath them until his fingers found the hidden panel. A hollow click sounded as the false bottom gave way. He pulled it open. Inside lay the box. He hesitated, then lifted it out. Smooth, dark wood, narrow as a shoebox. The key was still tied to the hinge with a bit of string. He hadn't opened it in years. He brought it to the table and set it down with a sound that made Catalina stir from the cot. She didn't speak. Her eyes were open now, fixed on the box. "I never showed this to anyone," he said, his voice quieter than the wind. Catalina didn't reply. He untied the string, inserted the key, and turned it. The lock clicked. The lid rose on silent hinges. Inside, the letters lay exactly as he'd left them. Dozens of them, neatly stacked, some bound together with silk ribbon. The ink was still clear on the topmost one, the script unmistakably Isadora's, angular, elegant, slightly slanted. The date was from a month before she died. He picked one at random from the middle of the stack and opened it. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the handwriting remained precise. His eyes scanned the first few lines, routine remarks about her health, the palace, a brief mention of her tutor's return from Salamanca. Then, a shift. "I've seen him again. In the corridor near the southern vestibule. I turned and he was gone. But I know it was him. The scent of cloves, the gloves, the limp. It's always the same. He watches, always at a distance. I haven't told Sebastian. He carries too much already, and I know he wouldn't believe me. But I feel a change coming. Something is unraveling." He folded the letter shut, slower this time. Catalina's voice came from the cot, low and steady. "You never read the last one." He looked at her sharply. She was still wrapped in the blanket, her arm pressed to her side, but her eyes were sharp, more alert now. The color had returned slightly to her cheeks, though her skin was still pale. "What last one?" he asked. "The one she meant to leave for you. The one she wrote the night before her fall." Sebastian stared at her, then looked back at the box. He checked again, faster this time, sorting through the bundles, loosening the ribbon from the final group of letters. And there it was. A folded sheet, thinner, unsealed, its edges worn. The signature on the bottom made his breath catch. Isadora. He hadn't seen this one before, not among the others. Not even during the hours he'd spent reading them, seeking meaning, clues, answers she'd never offered in life. He unfolded it and read. It was different from the rest. No formal greeting, no careful language. The handwriting was rushed, the lines uneven. "He knows. I saw him. Not the shadow this time. not the scent or the gloves. I saw him. His face. He was standing in the garden. He saw me watching. He didn't hide. Sebastian's fingers clenched around the paper. I told Catalina everything. I wasn't supposed to. They made sure we were kept apart, but I remembered. She remembered too. I think they knew from the beginning. That's why they sent her away. Luis warned me not to look into it. But I had to. I loved her like a sister. He stopped reading. Catalina didn't speak. Her gaze had dropped to the fire, the muscles along her jaw drawn tight. She loved you, Sebastian said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was stating a fact or asking a question. Catalina's throat moved, as if swallowing words too large to speak. She trusted me, she said after a long moment. Sebastian turned the letter over, searching for more, but the final lines had been written in a different hand. It was still Isadora's, but fainter, the pen strokes thinner, as if her strength had been leaving her. If anything happens to me, find Catalina. She knows the truth I could never speak. He lowered the page slowly. You didn't come here by accident. Catalina looked up, her eyes meeting his. No, she said. Then why now? Why not sooner? I had to stay hidden. There were people watching me, even after the funeral, and I didn't know if you'd believe me, or if you were part of it. The words hit him like the wind that had blown into the cabin hours ago. Cold. Heavy. I loved her, he said. Catalina nodded, the motion small. I know. He looked at her again. Truly looked. The lines of her face were softened by fatigue, but beneath it, he saw something unyielding. Not hardness, not bitterness, but purpose. Even now, injured and far from safe, she carried herself like a woman who'd already buried everything she once held dear and had nothing left to lose. I need to know everything, he said. Who you are, what happened between you, why she said what she did. Catalina shifted upright with a wince. Her hand went to her side, pressing the blanket tighter. You won't believe me until you see it for yourself. See what? The reason she was afraid. The reason she never told you everything. It wasn't just about the letters. Sebastian didn't answer. Catalina lifted her chin slightly. Bring me the locket. His brow furrowed. What locket? She didn't blink. The one she kept hidden. The one you didn't find. He hesitated. You're assuming I have it. I'm not, she said. I know where it is. She pointed, slowly, carefully, to the narrow cabinet near the window. Not the one with the false bottom. The other. He moved without speaking, opened the cabinet, pulled away the linen wrappings and old documents until he found the small wooden box beneath them. The box was unremarkable, smooth and square, with a simple clasp. He opened it. Inside lay a locket. Gold. Oval. Small enough to rest in a palm. He lifted it out, staring at it. It had belonged to Isadora. He remembered it vaguely. She had worn it when they first married, then stopped, saying the clasp was broken. He had never thought of it again. Catalina held out her hand. He passed it to her. With unsteady fingers, she opened the locket. On one side was the miniature portrait of Isadora. Soft eyes, delicate smile, rendered in delicate brush strokes. On the other side, a second portrait, partially scratched, the face nearly ruined, but not ruined enough. Even through the gouges, the likeness was unmistakable. Luis. The locket lay open in Catalina's hand, its tiny hinges trembling slightly with the movement of her breath. The firelight flickered over the two portraits, one pristine, the other defaced. Even so, there was no mistaking the features beneath the scratches. The high brow, the shape of the mouth, the faint suggestion of a scar along the right cheekbone. Sebastian knew them too well. He had seen them mirrored in his own face since boyhood. His brother. He did not speak, could not. His eyes stayed locked on the ruined miniature, and the weight of the locket in Catalina's palm seemed to grow heavier with every second. The silence in the cabin was no longer the silence of the storm, or of two strangers unsure of trust. It was the quiet of reckoning, of something sacred breaking. Catalina's voice was quiet, but steady. She wore this close to her skin, every day, even after she stopped showing it. She told me she kept it hidden because it was dangerous. But I think she couldn't bear to destroy it. Sebastian drew a breath that didn't quite fill his lungs. "Why him?" he asked. Catalina's gaze didn't leave the portraits. Because she trusted him. Once. He turned away sharply, walking to the hearth and bracing his hands on the mantel. The stone beneath his palms was warm, but his skin felt cold. There had been suspicions after Isadora's death, whispers, but nothing concrete. Nothing that had ever touched Luis, at least not directly. His elder brother had returned to Madrid weeks after the funeral, calm and composed, offering condolences, assuming responsibilities, and continuing his duties as though tragedy had merely brushed past the family rather than settled within it. Sebastian had never questioned him, not truly, because he'd needed to believe that something, anything, had remained untouched by betrayal. He turned slowly to face Catalina. "Tell me the truth. All of it." She looked at him with that same calm, composed expression. But her hands trembled slightly as she closed the locket and held it against her chest. "I knew Isadora before she married you. Years before. We met at a gathering in Valladolid. Both of us girls barely out of the convent. We were placed in adjoining houses for a season, and we became close." Her voice faltered slightly. "Closer than anyone thought proper. We kept it secret. For a time it was ours alone." Sebastian's heart pounded in his chest. He stayed silent. "When the court discovered it, rumors, a letter intercepted, we were careless. Everything changed. They separated us. I was sent to a convent near Cuenca. She was forced to make a suitable match." He already knew this part, in fragments, in shadows. Isadora had once hinted at a girl from her past, a dear friend, but never with bitterness. Only with a kind of wistful pain he hadn't fully understood at the time. Catalina continued, her voice firmer now. "She tried to find me again. I know she did. But someone made sure she couldn't. When I finally escaped the convent, years later, it was too late. She was already married to you." He watched her closely. "And Luis?" Her eyes darkened. "I saw him once at court, long after the wedding. He recognized me, smiled like he knew exactly who I was, and that I could do nothing. He never spoke to me, but I could feel it even then. The danger." Sebastian felt a slow, sickening wave crawl up his spine. The pieces of the past, scattered for so long, began to shift into place. "She wrote me," Catalina said. "She found a way, somehow. Letters arrived every few weeks, hidden in books, delivered by a girl from the laundry. She told me she was being watched, that there were things she couldn't say aloud. And then she stopped writing." Catalina's hands clenched in the blanket now, her fingers white against the fabric. "I tried to come. I went to the estate in Segovia. I waited outside the chapel. But I was too late. They told me she'd fallen, that she was dead." Sebastian closed his eyes, the memory of that day crashing back with brutal force. Isadora's lifeless body, the confusion, the bruises along her back from the fall down the stairs. The doctor had said she had lost her footing, that she had struck her head on the final step, but her expression in death had never looked peaceful. There had been fear etched into the line of her mouth, her fingers clenched tightly into fists. "I never believed it was an accident," Catalina said softly. Sebastian opened his eyes. "Then why didn't you speak?" Catalina looked up at him now. "Who would have listened? You disappeared into grief. The court forgot her. Your brother rose in influence, and I was the woman no one remembered, who had once loved her too deeply." The words stung, He turned from her again, moving to the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly. The storm had softened. Snow still drifted in lazy swirls across the clearing, but the wind had eased, and the trees no longer groaned under its weight. Dusk was coming. The pale blue light of afternoon was fading into gray, the sky smudged with ink and cloud. He let the curtain fall and turned back to the fire. "She asked me to burn the letters," he said. "I thought she was delirious, speaking from fear." Catalina's eyes met his. She wasn't. He sat at the table again, across from her. The locket still lay in her lap, her hand resting protectively over it. Between them, the candle flickered. "I want to see where she died," Catalina said quietly. "I need to." "You do too." The idea struck something deep inside him. He had avoided that hallway for years. Even now, the thought of standing on those stairs made his chest tighten. But Catalina was right. There were no more shadows to hide in. He nodded. They said nothing more for several minutes. The quiet returned, not heavy this time, but somber, settling over them like the last fall of snow. Then came the knock. Sebastian stilled. It was soft, but distinct. Not the wind, not branches. A knock. He stood slowly, his eyes narrowing. Catalina's hand drifted to the edge of the cot, gripping it. Another knock. Louder this time. Not rushed, deliberate. He crossed the room, keeping his steps silent. At the door, he paused, listening. Nothing but the wind outside. Then, another knock. 3 slow taps. He reached for the pistol on the mantel. The knock came again, and with it, a shadow darkened the crack beneath the door. He stepped forward, hand on the bolt, heart pounding. And then came a voice. Not loud, not hurried, but certain. "Open the door, Sebastian." Sebastian didn't move. His hand stayed frozen on the bolt, the weight of the pistol in his other hand heavier than any metal had the right to be. The voice had been muffled through the thick oak door, but unmistakably human, low, firm, and disturbingly calm. The storm, though softer now, still muttered beyond the shutters, but the silence inside the cabin was so complete, it was as though the air itself had stopped breathing. Catalina had sat up straighter on the cot. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the door. The blanket had slipped from her shoulder, and she didn't bother pulling it back. Her body was rigid. Neither of them spoke. The voice came again. "I'm not here to harm you." It didn't matter. No one knew how to find this cabin. No one except... Sebastian kept his gaze locked on the thick wooden planks of the door, heart thudding in his chest. He'd lived long enough in the court to know the sound of veiled threats, and that voice didn't belong to a man lost in the snow. He gave a quick shake of his head to Catalina, a silent order to stay back. He unbolted the door carefully. The handle was ice-cold beneath his fingers. Then without a word he opened it a few inches, enough to peer through. A man stood in the snow, wrapped in a dark wool cloak, the hood drawn low over his brow. No horse, no carriage, no trail behind him. Just snow, and a silence far too complete for someone who had climbed into the mountains. The stranger did not step forward. He held something in his hand. A letter. Sebastian's eyes fell to the seal stamped into the thick vellum. The red wax was clean and fresh, pressed with a symbol he hadn't seen since he left Madrid. The royal crest. "Take it," the man said. "I'm only the messenger." Sebastian studied him closely, but the man's face remained obscured, his breath fogging in the cold. Slowly, he extended one hand and took the letter, keeping the pistol low but ready. The man turned at once, walking back into the storm without a word, his boots not making a sound on the snow-packed earth. Sebastian stepped into the doorway, watching. The man's figure began to dissolve into the white, vanishing between the trees like a shadow swallowed by the fog. He left no tracks behind. He stood there a moment longer, every hair on his body rising. Then he stepped back into the cabin and shut the door. The bolt slid into place with a dull thud. Catalina was already on her feet. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low. Sebastian looked down at the letter in his hand. His fingers curled around the edges, as though they already knew what waited inside. He crossed to the table, set the pistol aside, and broke the wax seal. The parchment unfolded stiffly. The handwriting was elegant and measured. He recognized it at once, though the writer hadn't signed his name. Sebastian, your presence is required in Madrid. This is not a request. You are to present yourself before the Crown to give account of your current residence, your holdings, and your state of mind following your extended absence from court. No delay will be tolerated. A single line at the bottom bore only the seal again. No signature. No indication of who had truly sent it. Catalina stepped closer. They know. He nodded slowly, barely hearing his own voice. Or suspect. She reached for the parchment, but he folded it before she could touch it. We leave at dawn, she said. Sebastian looked at her. Her cheeks were flushed from standing, and the wound at her side had reopened. He could see a dark blot spreading slowly beneath the fabric, but her spine remained straight, her eyes steady. You're not in any condition to ride, he said. I don't care. He hesitated. We'll need supplies, he murmured. Fuel for the road, food. The storm has softened. If we leave before noon tomorrow, we can reach the river by nightfall. I'll be ready. She turned from him and sat slowly, wincing as her body protested the movement. Sebastian stared at the closed letter in his hand, his jaw tightening. Who had sent it? Luis's reach had always been long, longer than Sebastian had ever acknowledged. He could have sent the message under the pretense of royal will, all without touching pen to paper himself. Or perhaps someone else had taken interest in the whispers circling the court, in the disappearance of a woman long thought dead, in the brother who had fled the palace after burying his wife and never returned. He crossed the room to the cabinet once more, retrieved the documents and the locket, and wrapped them in cloth before placing them into a leather satchel. Then he moved about the room with methodical energy, gathering provisions, dried meat, hard bread, sealed tins of broth, a flask of clean water, and a handful of coins from a tin near the hearth. By the time the sun had fully dipped below the mountains, the fire had been stoked high again, and the air inside the cabin had begun to lose its edge. Catalina had fallen asleep at last, though her brow was furrowed even in rest. Sebastian watched her for a long time. He remembered Isadora's face the night she'd died, how she'd looked past him toward the ceiling, as though seeing something he couldn't. Her hands had trembled, but her voice had been clear. Don't let him find the letters. Was it possible she'd known, truly known, that someone from within their own blood had betrayed her? Sebastian reached for the candle on the table and snuffed the flame with his fingers. The room darkened to the low amber of firelight. The night passed slowly. He didn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw his brother's face, grinning behind a curtain of politeness and power. He saw the half-ruined portrait inside the locket, and beneath it all, he heard Isadora's voice over and over again. Promise me. The cabin remained silent through the night. The wind howled once, weakly, then died. By dawn, the world outside was still. Catalina woke to find Sebastian dressed for travel, his cloak already fastened, the bags packed and strapped. She rose with difficulty and dressed in silence, her movements slow but determined. By the time they stepped outside, the sun had just begun to pierce the pale sky. Mist clung low to the snow, curling around their boots. The horses, sheltered under the overhang, stamped nervously, but remained calm. They mounted and turned south, the path through the trees half obscured by drifts. The forest watched them pass. They rode without speaking for over an hour. The trail narrowed, then widened again near a frozen stream. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Catalina pulled lightly on the reins. "What is that?" she whispered. Sebastian followed her gaze. Near the threshold of the forest, something had been left half buried in the snow. He dismounted and approached slowly. It was a ribbon, thin, silk, crimson, the color of dried blood, and beneath it, barely visible in the snow, was a dark stain still fresh. Sebastian crouched beside the ribbon, his gloved fingers brushing away the snow that had already begun to settle over it. The silk unfurled reluctantly beneath his touch, curling at the edges like something once warm, now forgotten. A streak of blood, darker than the cloth, clung stubbornly to the center, not frozen. Fresh. He looked up. The clearing around them was silent, white, unmarred except for their own tracks. The snow had fallen gently overnight, and nothing should have moved since. No other footprints disturbed the surface, no broken branches, no trail, but someone had left this here. Catalina remained mounted a few paces behind him, one hand resting over her injured side, her eyes fixed on the ribbon with the same expression she had worn the night she first spoke Isadora's name. Not fear, not disbelief. Something older, a kind of bone-deep recognition. He rose slowly, the ribbon clutched in his hand, and scanned the tree line. Pines stood still and sharp, their limbs heavy with snow. The stream behind them murmured beneath its thin veil of ice. The mountains rose behind, cold and pale against the morning sky. Nothing stirred. But they were being watched. He turned back to the horses. "We keep moving," he said. Catalina nodded once. No questions, no protests. She understood. They rode hard for the next hour, pushing through the forest at a pace that bordered on reckless. The snow made every turn uncertain. Branches clawed at their cloaks. Their mounts stumbled more than once, but neither rider slowed. The air was sharper as they descended, colder despite the sun. And always, Sebastian felt the weight of unseen eyes at his back. It wasn't until they reached the edge of a familiar bend in the river that they dared stop. Here, the terrain sloped gently toward the water, and the sun reached past the trees enough to warm the surface into a thin glimmer. The river was still mostly frozen, but a narrow channel had cracked open through the center, dark water slipping silently beneath. Sebastian dismounted first, tying the reins to a low branch. Catalina followed slowly, her legs stiff, her face pale. She leaned against the saddle, catching her breath. He approached her, his voice low. "The wound?" "It's closed," she said, though her jaw tightened with the lie. He opened one of the saddlebags and pulled out a flask, uncorking it and handing it to her. She drank without hesitation. When she handed it back, her hand brushed his, a small contact, but he felt it like a jolt of heat. Their eyes met. "We'll stop here long enough to rest the horses," he said. "Not longer." Catalina nodded and turned toward the riverbank, her gaze distant. Sebastian kept watch. He stood at the edge of the trail, eyes sweeping the path behind them, ears trained for the snap of a twig, the flutter of a bird's wings, the quiet rhythm of breath not their own. But nothing came, no movement, no sound. Still, his hand never strayed far from the pistol at his hip. Minutes passed. The sun rose higher. The light through the trees became thinner, casting long blades of gold across the snow. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, tinged faintly with smoke, though from where, he couldn't tell. Catalina sat on a flat stone near the water's edge, her cloak wrapped tightly around her. She hadn't spoken since the clearing. He watched her, his thoughts circling the image of the locket, the letters, the bloodied ribbon. Each detail sharpened another edge of the truth he had tried not to see. For so long, he had blamed grief itself for Isadora's unraveling. Had told himself that love could not always protect, that some wounds ran deeper than any vow. But now, he turned sharply at the sound of hooves. The horses were shifting, restless. One of them, Catalina's gray, stamped hard enough to send a puff of snow into the air. Sebastian stepped forward quickly, calming the animal with a low murmur. His eyes swept the woods again. Still nothing. Then Catalina stood. "There's something under the ice," she said. He turned to her, She was staring into the narrow channel of open water. She didn't blink. He crossed the snow to her side and followed her gaze. The river's current was slow, nearly still, but beneath the sheen of cracked ice, something dark drifted just out of reach. He crouched, leaning over the edge, and squinted. Cloth. He extended his gloved hand and reached into the water, the cold biting through layers of leather and wool. His fingers brushed against something soft, then caught on the edge of fabric. He pulled. The current resisted. He braced his knee on the frozen bank, gripped the fabric with both hands, and heaved. The sound of ice cracking echoed across the trees. The shape surged upward, still caught, but enough to see it fully now. A man's coat, heavy wool, soaked through. The back of a shoulder, a limp arm, a body. Catalina gasped. Sebastian dragged it farther, ignoring the sting in his hands, until the shoulder rolled upward and the man's face turned toward the sky. Eyes open, pale, empty. A thick gash marked his temple, the wound fresh. Blood had pooled in the collar of his coat and frozen there. His skin was blue, his lips dark. Sebastian leaned closer, searching the face for recognition. But it wasn't anyone he knew, not a courtier, not a servant. But a messenger's pouch was strapped across his chest. He unfastened it quickly, pulling it free, and opened the flap. Inside, a folded document, stained and crumpled, no seal. He opened it. One line, written in a hurried, slanted hand. You were never meant to read the letter. Catalina stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. Sebastian stared at the words, his pulse quickening. He looked again at the face of the man in the ice. Who had sent the first letter then? If not this man, if not the one lying dead in the river, then someone else had reached him. Someone had known. The message had been intercepted, and whoever had sent the replacement wanted them to come back. He stood quickly. We leave now. Catalina didn't question him. She moved to her horse, wincing as she pulled herself into the saddle. Sebastian tied the pouch to his own saddle and mounted. The path ahead curved east toward the lower mountain passes. The road to Madrid lay just beyond. They pressed forward in silence. By late afternoon, they reached the first of the stone mile markers, half buried in snow, signaling their descent toward the edge of the city. The air had shifted, warmer now, heavier, the scent of distant fires, chimney smoke curling into the low sky, civilization and danger. The sun began to dip. The sky turned to ash, then rust, then pale violet. As they reached the next bend, Catalina drew a sharp breath and pointed. Across the snow-covered path stood the ruins of an old chapel, blackened stone, the roof half collapsed, the bell tower crumbled. It leaned slightly, as if time itself had tried to forget it. Sebastian pulled his horse to a halt beside her. Catalina's voice was barely above a whisper. It's where they sent me, after they separated us. She nudged her horse forward. He followed. The snow here was untouched. The silence was different, not soft like the forest, but hollow, reverent. They dismounted and walked together toward the entrance. The wooden doors had rotted away, leaving only the stone arch and the charred remnants of a threshold. Inside, the pews were shattered, the altar cracked. The air smelled of soot and mold, and the faint scent of burned incense that had somehow never left. Catalina walked ahead, her boots crunching over fragments of wood and ash. She stopped near the altar, then knelt beside the broken base of a statue. Her hands moved through the dust, searching. Sebastian stepped toward her. Her fingers found a small iron latch. With effort, she pulled it. The stone beneath the statue shifted with a grating sound. A narrow compartment opened. Inside, a bundle of old letters, tied with black ribbon, and at the very top, folded carefully, a page that bore Isadora's handwriting. Catalina reached for it, her hand trembling. But before her fingers touched the paper, a voice rang out behind them, sharp and unmistakable. It was only a matter of time before you found this place. Sebastian turned slowly, the hairs on the back of his neck already rising before the full shape of the voice's owner came into view. Luis stood in the ruined doorway of the chapel, framed by the fading light of dusk. Snow clung to his boots and the hem of his cloak, though he appeared otherwise untouched by the cold. His posture was composed, his hands gloved, one resting casually on the hilt of his sword. His expression bore no surprise, no fury, only the quiet calculation of a man who had known exactly when and where to appear. Catalina rose to her feet in one fluid motion, slipping the top letter from the bundle and hiding it within her cloak. Her face revealed nothing, but her fingers remained clenched, her shoulders rigid. She stood slightly behind Sebastian, but not in retreat, only prepared. Sebastian stepped in front of her. "You followed us." Luis lifted one brow. "No." "I knew where you would go." The remains of sunlight slanted across the stone floor, painting both brothers in fractured gold. The wind slipped through the broken roof above them, catching Luis's cloak and sending it rippling like the hem of a funeral banner. He moved forward, stepping into the chapel with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching softly over the debris. "You never could let well enough be, hermano. Always compelled to reopen graves." Sebastian's voice was low. Isadora wasn't a grave. She was a person. Luis tilted his head as if listening, then took one more step. She was a danger. The words landed like a blow, but Sebastian didn't flinch. To whom? Luis's lips curved faintly, though his eyes did not warm. To the wrong people. To herself. To the crown. To you. Sebastian's pulse beat like thunder in his ears. The implications in his brother's tone were subtle, carefully chosen, but not new. They reminded him of courtrooms, of salons filled with silence, of letters handed off with too much ceremony, of power hidden in civility. Catalina's voice cut through the thick air. "You tried to erase her." Luis turned his head, as if noticing her for the first time. "And you. You should have stayed in the convent where you belonged. You would have lived longer." The threat was quiet, not shouted, and it was that calmness that made it colder than the snow outside. Sebastian stepped toward him. "You had no right." Luis met his eyes. "I had the obligation." The moment hung in the air like a blade about to drop. The chapel darkened with the fading sun. Somewhere beyond the crumbled bell tower, a bird shrieked once, then went still. The silence that followed was suffocating. Luis moved then, faster than expected, closing the distance in 3 strides. He reached for Catalina. Sebastian intercepted him with a hard shove to the chest, sending him stumbling back a step. The blow landed with a dull sound, but Luis recovered quickly, his expression tightening as he regained his footing. "So you choose her over your own blood," he said. "I choose the truth," Sebastian said, breathing hard. Luis's gloved hand dropped to his side and returned with a pistol. Catalina didn't cry out. She didn't move. But Sebastian stepped in front of her again, heart slamming against his ribs. Luis lifted the weapon. The truth can be bent, burned, buried. Sebastian reached for his own pistol slowly, not raising it. But it never dies. They stood that way for a breathless instant. 2 brothers in the ruin of a forgotten chapel, surrounded by ash and silence, with decades between them and no trust left to close the distance. Then a shout rang out, distant, male, somewhere beyond the chapel ruins. It was followed by the sound of galloping hooves. Luis didn't look away, but his eyes flickered. He turned sharply and fired. The shot cracked through the space like a whip. Catalina gasped. Sebastian dropped low, dragging her behind the altar, shielding her body with his own. Another shot rang out, his own pistol, fired in reflex. The ball slammed into stone behind Luis, sending up a spray of dust and rock. Luis ducked and disappeared into the shadows of the doorway. Silence fell again, but only for a moment. Then the sound of boots, more than one pair, entered the clearing beyond the chapel. Shouts now, closer. A call in a voice Sebastian didn't recognize. He peeked over the altar's edge. No sign of Luis, just the empty arch where the door had once stood and the snow beyond it, pinked by sunset. Catalina clutched his arm, breath ragged. "You're hit," he said. She shook her head. "It's reopened, not new." He turned toward the hidden compartment. The bundle of letters was still there, untouched. He snatched it up and shoved it into his coat, then pulled Catalina to her feet. Her legs buckled for a moment, but he caught her. They stumbled through the nave, half running, past the shattered pews and out into the twilight. 4 riders entered the clearing from the opposite side. Men in cloaks, dark uniforms, armed. Sebastian recognized none of them, but they moved with the purposeful tension of those who knew they were not welcome. He reached for Catalina's arm, ready to pull her into the trees. But the man in front raised a hand, palm out. "Prince Sebastian de Aragon," he called. "You are summoned by the council, by royal command." Sebastian said nothing, his breath plumed in the cold air. The man lowered his voice, stepping closer. "This time, you cannot refuse." Sebastian's eyes flicked past them to the woods, but it was too late for escape. He turned slowly toward Catalina, whose face had drained of all color. He reached for her hand, but when he touched her, she was ice cold, and her knees gave way before he could catch her. Sebastian caught her just before she hit the ground, her weight folding into his arms like a bundle of damp fabric. Catalina's skin was cold, unnaturally so. Her breath came in shallow pulls, uneven and fragile. He sank to his knees in the snow, holding her upright, pressing his hand to her side. Warmth bloomed against his palm, fresh blood seeping fast. Her wound had reopened completely. She grimaced, her head falling against his shoulder. "Don't let them take the letters," she whispered, barely audible. "I won't," he said, though he wasn't sure if she could still hear him. The approaching riders had dismounted now, their boots crunched in the snow, measured and deliberate. Sebastian could feel the eyes of all 4 men on him, waiting, assessing. He kept one arm around Catalina's back, the other shielding the inside of his coat where the letters rested. No one moved to help them. The tallest of the 4 stepped forward. His uniform bore the insignia of the council, dark fabric trimmed with black braid, a medallion of silver fastened at the shoulder. His face was unreadable, hardened by years in a role that rarely required mercy. "You're both to come with us," the man said. Sebastian didn't answer. The man glanced down at Catalina, then back at Sebastian. "She will receive care, at once." "I'll take her," Sebastian said, already shifting to lift her. "You'll ride behind." The man gave a terse nod. One of the others brought forward Sebastian's horse. He mounted with Catalina in front of him, holding her tightly against his chest, as if the force of his arms could slow her bleeding. She didn't stir. Her face pressed into the crook of his shoulder, her breath faint against his neck. They rode without delay, the 4 riders forming a loose perimeter around them as they moved south through the thinning trees. The road widened as they descended, the trail sloping toward the distant glimmer of Madrid. It was twilight now, the sky deepening to indigo, pierced by early stars. The city's outline grew larger with every mile, the clustered rooftops, the narrow towers, the rising smoke of evening hearths. Catalina stirred once as they approached the first outer walls, a faint sound catching in her throat. He leaned down. "We're nearly there." She didn't reply. The guards exchanged no words. They rode in practiced silence, guiding them through a side gate where no townspeople lingered. The air grew thicker here, more stagnant, laced with smoke and the scent of soot-covered stone. The streets narrowed and darkened, the buildings rising taller around them as they turned deeper into the old quarter. Finally, they reached the courtyard of an aging structure of white limestone, weathered and pitted, its arched windows shuttered and its columns draped in ivy. Sebastian knew it. El Palacio del Consejo de Castilla, once the seat of Spain's most powerful judicial body, now a place of whispers and quiet sentences. A servant emerged from the lower steps and took the horses. Catalina remained in his arms, unmoving. "She needs a physician," Sebastian said to the nearest rider. The man gestured toward a side corridor. "They've been summoned. Take her inside." Sebastian didn't wait for help. He carried her through the wide wooden doors, past cold marble floors and arched ceilings where torchlight flickered against carved stone. Echoes followed their steps, as though the walls themselves listened. A small antechamber was prepared, a narrow cot with clean sheets, a basin of heated water, cloths and herbs laid neatly on a side table. Catalina was too pale as he lowered her gently onto the bed. Her breath caught again, a weak sound of pain. She blinked up at him, her eyes glassy. "Don't stay with me. I'm not leaving. They'll use it, me, to control you." He brushed her hair away from her face, the strands damp with sweat. "Then they'll have to kill me first." Footsteps echoed down the corridor. A woman appeared in the doorway, middle-aged, wrapped in a physician's cloak, her hands already scrubbed. She took one look at Catalina and stepped into the room briskly. "You'll need to leave," she said to Sebastian. "I'm not going anywhere." The physician glanced at him, but didn't argue. "Then help me keep her still." Time blurred into motion after that. The room filled with the rustle of cloth, the hiss of water being poured, the low commands of the physician. Sebastian held Catalina's hands, whispering soft things he barely heard himself, while the woman worked, cleaning the wound, stitching it closed with practiced speed. Catalina groaned once, but didn't cry out. At last, the bleeding slowed, her breathing evened. The physician leaned back, wiping her brow. "She'll live," she said, "but not without rest." Sebastian nodded once, the knot in his throat refusing to loosen. "You may stay for 1 hour," the woman added. "Then you'll be summoned." He barely heard her. Catalina slept. The hour passed with aching slowness. When the knock came at the door, Sebastian stood, his limbs reluctant to move. He looked down at her, still pale, still fragile, but breathing steadily now. He adjusted the blanket across her shoulders and bent low to press his lips to her temple. Then he left the room. 2 men escorted him down the corridor, their pace steady, their silence deliberate. They passed beneath high windows, their glass latticed with lead, the last of the daylight seeping through. The hall curved to the right, then ended at a wide set of double doors. Inside was a chamber he hadn't seen in years. It had once been a council room, though now its grandeur was faded. The wooden benches were worn. The dais at the far end bore 3 chairs, each occupied by a judge robed in black. A long table stood in the center, cleared of all but a small oil lamp and a carafe of water. Sebastian was guided to stand before the table. No one spoke for a moment. Then the center judge, older than the others, with hair as white as parchment, cleared his throat. "Don Sebastian de Aragon," he began, "you have returned under unusual circumstances." "I came when summoned," Sebastian said. "You delayed your return to court for nearly 3 years. I had my reasons." The judge tapped a long finger against the table. "Your brother Luis de Aragon informed us of your condition, your retreat, your grief, and your refusal to resume your duties." Sebastian said nothing. "And yet here you are, with a wounded woman, a woman thought dead." The tension in the room pulsed like a held breath. "Her name," Sebastian said, "is Catalina. She was my wife's dearest friend. She has proof that Isadora's death was no accident." The leftmost judge, younger, leaned forward slightly. "You claim your wife was murdered?" "I do." The center judge raised a brow. "And you accuse your brother of complicity?" Sebastian met his gaze. "Not complicity, responsibility." A murmur passed between the judges. "We have seen the letters recovered from the chapel," said the third judge, a woman with a voice like paper folding. "They implicate several members of the court, including your brother. Are you prepared to stand by them under oath?" "I am. Even if it means the end of your title, your holdings. I don't care about those things. The elder judge's voice softened. Then what do you care about? Sebastian didn't hesitate. Justice. For her. For Isadora. Silence followed his words. Then the eldest judge leaned forward. Then you must answer, on the record, this final question. Sebastian straightened. The judge's voice was clear, deliberate. Are you prepared to testify under oath that your brother lied to the crown? Sebastian's voice did not tremble. I am prepared. The words landed softly in the chamber, but their weight was undeniable. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the three judges, cloaked in authority and practiced restraint, did not hide their surprise at the ease with which he spoke. The eldest judge leaned back in his chair, the candlelight catching on the edge of his signet ring. He did not nod, did not offer any approval, but something in the set of his features shifted, an acknowledgement of the seriousness in Sebastian's tone. This was not a man wielding accusation for ambition or vengeance. This was a man with nothing left to lose. The remaining proceedings moved forward with measured formality. Questions were asked, answers given. Sebastian recounted what he could, his wife's final moments, the letters Isadora had left behind, Catalina's reappearance and the locket, the message pulled from the frozen river, and Luis's sudden arrival at the ruined chapel. The judges listened, silent, never interrupting, not even when the tension in the room thickened like humidity before a storm. The letter from Isadora, found among the ashes beneath the altar, was read aloud. Her handwriting wavered across the page, lines of fear and resignation. I know who watches me now. I have seen his face, and I will never be able to unsee it. If this letter reaches your hands, Sebastian, know that I loved you. But I was not strong enough to tell you while I lived. Catalina's name appeared several times, mentioned with tenderness, with trust, with hope that one day truth might find its way into light. Sebastian kept his gaze steady throughout the reading, even when the pain in his chest threatened to rise like a tide and drown him where he stood. When the judges finally adjourned, it was past midnight. The flames in the wall sconces had grown low, flickering in their sconces like tired sentinels. He was led not to a prison cell or a guarded room, but to a private chamber on the upper floor, a modest, clean space with a narrow bed and a small table. A carafe of water had been left near the window, along with bread and a basin for washing. He did not eat. He stood by the narrow window, hands braced on the sill, looking down at the courtyard where the moonlight softened the stones and cloaked the world in silver. The city lay beyond the gates, quieter than he remembered. There had been a time, long ago, when he had walked those streets with Isadora beside him, her gloved hand tucked into his, laughter slipping like pearls between them. He remembered the way her veil had blown sideways in the wind that first spring together, and how he had lifted it just to see her eyes better. Now all he had were echoes, and one woman, still alive, who had risked everything to bring those echoes to the surface again. At dawn, a knock at the door broke the stillness. He opened it to find a court attendant waiting, a young man with cautious eyes and a rolled document in his hand. You are summoned, the man said. The council has reached its decision. Sebastian followed without a word, his boots silent on the marble floors. They passed through the same halls, now washed in early morning light. When they entered the chamber, the judges were already seated. This time, a fourth chair had been placed beside the table. A physician stood near it, hands folded. And in the chair, wrapped in layers of wool and a cloak too large for her frame, sat Catalina. She looked impossibly pale, but her eyes found him immediately. He crossed the room and sat beside her. The eldest judge began to speak. Prince Sebastian de Aragon, Lady Catalina de los Rios, the evidence presented to this council has been weighed carefully. The letters of the late Princess Isadora, the testimonial of the witness, the intercepted message, and the confrontation at the chapel. Each has been considered. He paused, letting the room absorb his words. This chamber cannot rule over matters of the soul, nor undo what time has already taken. but it can recognize when the laws of the crown have been broken, and when the power of noblemen has been wielded with dishonor. Catalina's fingers brushed against Sebastian's under the table. Your brother Don Luis de Aragon has been summoned. He will face a separate inquiry before the higher tribunal. His political duties have been suspended until further notice. Sebastian's chest rose with a slow breath, measured but deep. It was not justice, not fully, but it was more than silence. The judge continued. As for you, Prince Sebastian, you are to remain outside of courtly affairs until the conclusion of the investigation. This is not a punishment. It is a preservation of truth and of peace. Sebastian nodded once. Understood. The judge turned to Catalina. Lady Catalina de los Rios, you are hereby cleared of all suspicion. Your disappearance will not be pursued. Your testimony has not only aided this inquiry, but has also shed light on the mishandling of several matters once thought resolved. Catalina lowered her gaze slightly, her mouth pressed into a line that trembled faintly. The judges rose. The verdict had been spoken. They left the room one by one, their robes sweeping quietly over the stones. No one else remained except the physician, who stepped forward and gestured toward Catalina. She needs rest, he said gently. I'll take her, Sebastian answered. He helped her to her feet, steadying her with an arm around her waist. Her weight leaned into him, not fully, but enough to let him know that she trusted him to carry what she couldn't, at least for now. They walked through the quiet corridors side by side. No guards followed. No officials waited. Once outside, the air was clear, the morning sharp with sunlight. A carriage had been prepared, one of the old royal ones. Catalina hesitated at its steps. Not this, she whispered. No more walls. I want to see the sky. He glanced at the driver. Horses, too. Within minutes, 2 mounts had been brought forth. Catalina's gray stood among them. She touched its neck as if recognizing an old friend. The other was Sebastian's black stallion, restless as always, its breath rising in clouds. They rode slowly through the city. Shutters opened as they passed, early shopkeepers sweeping the stone steps, children peeking out from behind skirts, pausing their games to watch 2 strangers glide past on horseback. No one recognized them. The city had already begun its next chapter. They stopped in front of a narrow building, modest, with a faded green door and a second-floor balcony overlooking the street. Catalina looked at it a long moment before speaking. This is where I want to stay. Sebastian dismounted first, then helped her down carefully. You don't need to go back into hiding, he said. I'm not hiding, she replied. I'm living. He walked her to the door. Inside, a woman waited, a midwife perhaps, or an old friend. Catalina greeted her softly, then turned back to him before crossing the threshold. I'll write, she said. Sebastian nodded. And I'll answer. Her lips curved. Not a smile exactly, but something close. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. Some things had to heal in silence. He stepped back as the door closed behind her. And as the sun lifted higher over Madrid, he turned toward the street, toward the stables, toward the road, toward whatever came next. The mountains had begun to thaw. It was a quiet transformation, not sudden or dramatic. The snow retreated slowly from the shoulders of the hills, pulling back like lace on a hem, revealing earth and rock beneath. Pine needles, long buried, re-emerged in patches of brown and green. The river, once imprisoned by ice, moved again with a low murmur, cutting through the valley with its familiar song. Sebastian rode alone along the trail that wound up from the lowlands toward the Sierra de Guadarrama. It had been nearly 2 months since his departure from Madrid, since the tribunal had spoken its verdict, since Catalina had walked into her quiet new life, and he into his. He had not returned to the estate immediately. There had been things to settle first, land to oversee, letters to answer. The careful dissolving of all the remnants of court life that still clung to his name like ivy around stone. He had let them fall one by one, until nothing remained but himself. Now, at last, he was ready. The cabin came into view near midday, half hidden among the tall pines. The same as it had been, yet altered by the season. The snow had melted from the roof, and the door stood slightly ajar, as if welcoming the first soft winds of spring. The hearth would be cold. The shelves would be bare, but he felt no hesitation as he dismounted and led his horse toward the wooden hitching post. The door creaked as it opened. Dust floated in slanted beams of light. He stepped inside, drawing the familiar scent into his lungs. Pine, ash, old wood warmed by sun. The chairs still faced the hearth. The curtain at the back had been drawn aside, revealing the narrow alcove where he had once stored the box, the letters, the pieces of a past he had carried in silence. He stood still, letting the silence greet him like an old companion. Then, without ceremony, he began to move. He opened the shutters one by one, letting light spill into the room in golden waves. He stoked the hearth and started a fire, the wood catching with a hiss and a sudden bloom of warmth. He brought water from the stream and set a pot to boil. It was not comfort, not yet, but it was life. And that was enough. By evening, the light outside softened to amber. Shadows lengthened, stretching like fingers across the forest floor. He sat near the fire, his cloak draped over the back of the chair, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone lukewarm. He hadn't expected company, which was why the sound of hooves approaching sent his heart lurching, his pulse quickening in a way he couldn't suppress. He stood slowly, walking to the door and pulling it open. She was there. Catalina dismounted before he could move. She wore a riding cloak of deep gray, the hood pushed back to reveal her face, flushed from wind and travel. Her hair was unbound, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She held the reins loosely in one hand and a satchel in the other. They stood that way for a moment. The forest hushed around them. "I heard the mountains were beautiful this time of year," she said. He stepped forward. "You should have sent word." "I didn't want to wait for a reply." He took the reins from her gently and led the horse to the post, then turned back toward her. "Are you staying?" he asked. Her smile was quiet. "If you want me to." He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled louder now. She walked in ahead of him, setting the satchel down beside the table, peeling off her gloves with unhurried movements. She touched the edge of the mantel, ran her fingers along the stone as if reacquainting herself with the place that had once sheltered her in desperation. She turned toward him. "I wasn't sure you'd come back here. I needed to. To remember? To begin again." Her eyes softened. She stepped forward and reached for his hand. When her fingers closed around his, it was like warmth returning to a long frozen limb. Unexpected, welcome, necessary. They sat by the fire together, the light wrapping around them like a blanket. Outside, the forest settled into stillness, birds retreating to their nests, the breeze curling low to the earth. Catalina leaned her head against his shoulder. "Isadora would have liked it here," she murmured. He looked into the flames. "She would. She's why we survived, you know." He nodded. They didn't speak of the letters anymore. Not of Luis. Not of the tribunal, or the pain, or the nights spent fearing shadows. Those things had shaped them, but they no longer held them captive. The truth had been spoken. The dead had been honored. What remained now was quiet and choice. When he turned his head toward her, she looked up at him, her eyes lit with something quiet and luminous. He kissed her. It was not urgent, not desperate. But it carried all the things they had left unsaid, the ache, the hope, the wonder of still being here after everything had tried to destroy them. She pressed her forehead to his. "Are we foolish to think we can start over?" "No," he whispered. "Only brave." Later, as the fire burned low, they sat wrapped in one blanket, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full of breath, of warmth, of the sound of her heart resting near his. Outside, The wind changed direction, carrying the scent of new growth, of thawed soil, and the promise of green things to come. The past no longer reached for them. They had already begun. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.